No Small Endeavor is brought to you by Progressive. Most of you aren't just listening right now. You're driving, cleaning, and even exercising. But what if you could be saving money by switching to Progressive? Drivers who save by switching save nearly $750 on average, and auto customers qualify for an average of 7 discounts. Multitask right now. Quote today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $744 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary. Discounts not available in all states and situations.
Ever wondered how artificial intelligence or 3D printing is used to solve medical problems? Or how medical research is discovering new ways to slow or stop medical conditions we used to think of as untreatable? Listen to Tomorrow's Cure, where host Kathy Werzer interviews experts from Mayo Clinic and other renowned organizations, such as Cleveland Clinic, Johns Hopkins Hospital, or the Veteran Health Administration. Get a glimpse into these brilliant minds as they share how they use innovative thinking in their pursuit of answers for patients. What they describe may sound futuristic, but listen and you will find out Tomorrow's Cure is already here. Find Tomorrow's Cure wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Lee Seacamp. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. This is our unabridged interview with Emi Nietfeld. Emi has a classic rags to riches story, from homelessness to Harvard. It's the classic pull yourselves up by your own bootstrap story. You may or may not remember that Horatio Alger was the author who wrote a great host of stories that are the pull yourselves up by your own bootstraps, early American 20th century stories that became a genre, it seems, unto itself. Emi actually won a Horatio Alger Award because of her own story of moving from psych wards to state institutions for mental illness to foster care to homelessness, and then finding her way to Harvard. And yet one of the things I always tell my students is that nuance is your friend, that moralisms and conventional wisdom are often best served up with experience informed by nuance and care for story. And Emi's story is indeed one that is much more complicated than it might appear at the beginning. I really enjoyed her book, and I was even profoundly moved by the closing pages of her book. And I found my conversation with her moving and sometimes troubling and provocative of a great deal of consideration and reconsideration of some of the things we might think to be true. Enjoy. Hey friends, if you like listening to stories that teach you something, then I have a great podcast recommendation for you, Cautionary Tales, the chart-topping history podcast from Pushkin. We've all heard the saying, learn from your mistakes, but couldn't the same be true for other people's mistakes? On Cautionary Tales, you hear a treasure trove of mishaps and meltdowns that teach us all something. Each episode, Financial Times columnist Tim Harford mines the greatest fiascos of the past for their most valuable lessons. Some stories may delight you, others may scare you, but they'll all make you wiser. Like, how did efforts to control the weather go disastrously awry? Or, what's the connection between the medieval dancing plague and Havana syndrome? That and more. Don't miss out. Listen to Cautionary Tales wherever you get your podcasts. Emi Nietfeld, a former software engineer, is an author writing about mental health, inequality, and education for The Atlantic, Teen Vogue, Slate, and elsewhere. She lives in New York City with her family, and today we're discussing her book entitled Acceptance, a memoir of her journey from foster care and homelessness to Harvard and big tech. Emi, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's a delight to have you with us today. As I told you before we started the interview, I felt really moved by your book and moved by how you had the courage to share all the things you share and tell all the things you tell, and the deeply moving way I thought the book closed. But I just thank you and honor you and appreciate your courage and all of that. I thought what I would like to do is start kind of with part one, having some time to talk about your childhood and adolescence. And I think one of the early stories that really caught my attention was your first going to therapy as a fourth grader and by your mother. And as you kind of share that story, this, what would be thought of on the outside, I suppose, as an act of help for someone, seemed to be instead more a manipulation, that you were being used as a pawn, I suppose. But how would you describe that and the significance of that early moment in your childhood?
I grew up for the first 9 years of my life in a two-parent, middle-class family in Minnesota. And things were definitely not idyllic. My parents had a very tumultuous marriage, which was occasionally violent. But, I was kind of content, able to focus on my goals, which, at the time included becoming a Christian comedian, attending Moody Bible Institute. I was very religious and found a lot of meaning and comfort in that.
I think you were a Bible memorization champion as
I
well.
I was the state champion of Minnesota in fourth grade. I memorized thousands of verses. And then one day when I was in fourth grade, my mom came and picked me up from school and bribed me not to tell my father where we were going. And she drove me on this rainy afternoon to a place called the Christian Recovery Center, which was a ominous sounding therapy clinic. And then I went to what was called play therapy. But I was immediately skeptical. I was like, why am I coming here? I wasn't having emotional problems. I was doing just fine. But my parents' marriage had been on the rocks, was getting worse. And I almost immediately sensed that my mom was there to try to dig up evidence that my father had abused me. And, my father could be very strict. There was corporal punishment, but there was nothing that I could confess. I didn't have anything. And yet it quickly became clear that this treatment that is supposedly in kids' best interest and, who wouldn't bring their child to therapy, right? It always seems like such a good thing to do, but that it was a way to manipulate me or to try to get me to say things that were going to change my life in ways that I really did not want my life to change.
Soon thereafter, if I remember the timeline, your father announces, I think as you put it in the book, he announced to you that he's changing his name to Michelle, and then he leaves the family. Is that correct?
Yeah. And so, in hindsight, my mom didn't need a big confession because my father came out as a trans woman and announced that she was going to change her name and transition. And that is, if you're a evangelical Christian who wants to get a divorce, there's really no better reason than, that you don't want to be in a lesbian marriage. So my parents quickly separated after that.
And then when do you first recollect the sense that things are deeply disturbed or your mother's dealing with her own sorts of issues, mental illness?
A few months after my parents split up, it started to become clear that despite their problems in their relationship, that they really had kind of stabilized each other. Where my mom had been shopping a lot in secret during her lunch hour, and she would buy things like 100 Winnie the Pooh wristwatches at $1 each and hide them in her office at work. But once my dad was no longer living with her, it was like all of those things that were secret were suddenly out in the open. And there was really no checks or balances for either of my parents' behavior. And so within a couple of months, my mom had accumulated tons and tons of stuff in the apartment where she was living, a pattern that was only going to get worse over the years that followed.
When coming out of that early experience with therapy, what are some of the consequences for you as far as medicine, ways you began to think of yourself, or what are some of your earliest memories of significant changes that occur out of that time for you?
When I went to therapy for the first time, it was really when I stopped trusting adults. I had always been a goody two-shoes, teacher's pet. I was, I grew up basically as an only child, even though I have a half brother. And so I just always wanted to make adults happy. And I basically believed that if I was good, they would be proud of me and I would get what I wanted. And suddenly it seemed to me like I was navigating this world in which I really could not trust the people who were claiming that they were trying to help me. And this manifests during the custody evaluation, where my parents fought over custody for a little more than a year. And it was a very brutal battle over who would get me. And eventually my mom won. And my other parent, Michelle, moved across the country, and I have never seen her since. And my mom also kept bringing me to therapy. And I remember after she had custody, I was at the beginning of 6th grade, and in my medical records from that first session with a family therapist, it says that my mother is looking for evidence to shore up her custody decision. So she brought me there, trying to get me to say things about my father so that she would continue to have full custody. And it also, it's hard because it seems like something any reasonable parent would do, right? If you believe your child has been hurt, and I think my mom definitely believed that, you want to get help for them. And a divorce is stressful for any child. And I think many people would be like, okay, therapy is great. But unfortunately, the type of therapy that I was receiving was not what felt like in my best interest or focused on what I was feeling or what I needed. Instead, my mom told the therapist, I think Emi has ADHD. She said that I was disorganized, chronically late. Like, what 11-year-old is not disorganized and chronically late? But I was given a very short assessment, and I was sent to receive medication. And once I was at the doctor, I got ADD medication. And when that made me feel worse, I got another ADD medication. And then I got Xanax to deal with the panic attacks that stimulants gave me. And then they said, okay, well, if you're not responding to ADD medication, it must mean you're depressed. And so then I took all these different antidepressants and eventually within 2 years ended up on antipsychotics. And by then, I was really convinced that I was the problem or that there was something deeply wrong with me, at least biochemically, that only medication could solve. When in fact, in hindsight, it seems like I was really dealing with a lot of side effects, with withdrawal, with people were not really talking about how hard it can be to come off these drugs back then. And instead, I was just pulled off one after another until I was in a really dark place. I was doing things to cope that were not healthy for me. I was harming myself. I was not eating. I wanted to die. And in part, it was because it seemed like those were the only options available to me to cope. And also, it was kind of what everybody expected of me.
Yeah, you said at one point, no one would listen to me, no one would trust me, no one came. I can't imagine kind of the sense of desperately wanting someone to kind of see into your life and what's really going on, and not having anyone who will see, who will really pay attention or witness what's going on. Unpack some of that for us, if you will.
From the first family therapy appointment after my mom won custody, I was begging the psychologist, come to my mom's house, come see how we're living. Because, her shopping had gotten really bad. There were waist-high piles of stuff everywhere with mice running through them. We had mildew. There was this stench throughout everything. And it would get so bad that we didn't have hot water for several weeks. We didn't have a place to shower. And I was like, you have to come see our house, and then you'll understand why I feel bad when I feel bad. And yet, he was not going to come. Like, therapists don't usually make house calls. And over the years that followed, as I was given all of these different medications, I continued to try to tell the adults, like, hey, here's what's happening, right? My mom has a problem. But it really felt like nobody was listening to me or nobody believed me. And in hindsight, when I was writing acceptance and I requested all of these thousands of pages of medical records, I discovered that, people had heard what I was saying and that my mom had some issues, but there was really very little that they felt that they could do, short of call Child Protective Services and risk me ending up in foster care. And so instead, it just felt like I was screaming into the void and that nothing that I was going to say could matter.
Yeah. So then this begins to somewhat quickly devolve into everything getting ramped up, right? You end up, psych ward, institutional rehab programs of various sorts, and then in time, a boarding school that's mixed with times of homelessness. But could you kind of point to some of the, so people can kind of get a glimpse of kind of how this unfolds? What are kind of key things you would point to in the way all of this devolves?
When I was 13, I went to the psych ward for the first time. And I loved the psych ward. It was so much nicer than being at home. They had endless hot water for showers. The air was clean. I felt like I could hear myself think in a way that I absolutely could not at my mom's house. And so after I was feeling a little better and I was discharged, I just immediately wanted to come back. And I wound up kind of going in and out of the hospital several times over that year before I was finally 14 and got sent to a locked residential treatment facility. And that was one of those places that has bars over the windows, 3 sets of locked doors, a padded isolation room for when kids act out. And it was a very punitive place where we were expected to really take full responsibility for our lives, as teenagers who were mostly coming from these really difficult situations. And my education was also really hindered because we did not go to regular school. Instead, we had a classroom on site that was staffed by special education department teachers who guided us through multiplication worksheets and had us read aloud from books. And as somebody who had all of these academic ambitions, that was like torture for me because I had always found solace in reading, in studying, in imagining being able to leave my family and go to this magical place where there would be filled with people like me, spending time at the library. And so while I was there, I feel very fortunate that I was able to get my hands on a library ACT prep book. And I could start studying for the standardized test and teaching myself all of the stuff that I was missing in school. And that gave me agency. It gave me shape to my days. And it helped me imagine, like, okay, maybe when I get out of this place, I can go away to college. And that was really what got me through when I was at the end of a year. I was discharged into foster care. I went to go live with a family way out in the suburbs, like in the middle of a cornfield. And they believed that my ambition caused my misery and really, tried to discourage me from studying so much. But it was also a period of relative stability for me that helped me eventually get a scholarship to camp, an arts camp, and then a scholarship to boarding school, where I spent my junior and senior year really focused on, okay, how could I get into college? How can I get into the type of college that will give me a full ride, which meant an Ivy League university, and the type of place that will just completely change my life so that I don't have to rely on my mom, so that I don't have to rely on my social worker, and so that I can have this kind of future that I've been dreaming about since I was in this locked facility. Yeah.
So I want to come back to the dream of Ivy League, but before we get there, you've already kind of alluded to this in a couple of the comments that you've made, but as we've already noted, the book's title, Acceptance, and this becomes a sort of heavy thread, I think, running throughout the book, and especially as you narrate your childhood and adolescent experience, you kind of depict the way you're hearing from therapists and social workers and so forth talk about acceptance. It's almost like it's a blunt instrument kind of used against you. You say, quote, "Shrinks preach the doctrine of radical acceptance, which did not seem like the best fit for my situation." Or they say, "Focus on what you can control," the shrinks preached, "but who could be controlled seemed more relevant." Or then again, you say, "The dogma, only you are responsible for your emotions." So share with us a little bit more about how this sort of notion of acceptance becomes this sort of kind of emotional. You get, it seems like you're getting emotionally bludgeoned, so I suppose, with the notion of radical acceptance.
Absolutely. Almost all of the therapy that I received taught that acceptance was the key to solving any emotional problem. So you are in a bad situation, you are feeling bad because of it. What is the solution? The solution is just to accept that you're in this situation, accept that you're not getting out of it, and then you can find some emotional freedom. And I really hated this idea. It seemed very untrue to me because I was in a bad situation at home with the psychiatric drugs, with the treatment, with school. And sometimes when you're in a bad situation, I just need to change the situation, right? The situation is the problem, not me. But I was told this again and again and again, that like my refusal to accept was almost like a moral failure and was the reason that I was depressed when I was in foster care, living with strangers who thought that my art history homework of Michelangelo's David was pornography, right? My problem is that I am not accepting being in foster care and being adequately mindful every day that I'm spending in this family where I don't belong. And that was how I named the book Acceptance, was almost in defiance of this idea. Because after a while, I was so sick of it. I was like, I am not going to accept these circumstances. I want to fight against them with everything I have in me so that one day my life can look different than it does. And I don't think those two ideas are necessarily in opposition, but definitely it was framed as though they were. And at a time when I needed support and help to how are we going to change my life? How are we going to make my life bearable? Because I was going through things that would make anybody super depressed and down. And instead I received this false gospel of acceptance.
Yeah. I want to come back to that conversation here as we get closer to the end of the interview, because I think there's a lot more for us to pick up on that, but thank you for that. So here you are in going through this season, and you alluded a moment ago to the fact that you're also getting into the season of doing very significant self-harm, and yet at the same time, juxtaposed with that, you've got this sort of new dream that's giving you energy and that's giving you some sort of hope that you're beginning to push toward, learning books, having a dream of going to the Ivy Leagues, and so on. what do you think, or let me back up with that. Why do you think that particular dream caught you?
I think I got this dream of going to an elite university from my mom. As a girl, she had dreamed about attending Stanford, which at the time was the only elite research university that accepted women. Everywhere else was men only in her generation. And so she had, strived to get in when she was a girl and had ultimately not been accepted, and instead went to a small satellite campus of the University of Minnesota. But throughout my childhood, she talked about Stanford all the time. And it would be 8 a.m, pitch black, winter, Minnesota morning. We're scraping ice off the windshield of the car while freezing. And my mom would be like, if I had just gotten into Stanford, I would be living in California right now. And, there would be an issue with my dad, and my mom would be like, if I'd gone to California, I would have married a doctor. Or she would come home from work and be like, if I had just gotten into Stanford, I would be a neurosurgeon, not a crime scene photographer. And I think to many people, this sounds delusional in a way, to think that like, oh, if you just got into a different college, your whole life would be different. But I think that I recognized a truth to it, even when I was a child and a teenager. And I definitely recognize a truth to it now. And I feel very grateful that I was kind of given this doorway that it might be possible to walk through, that could just a portal that could totally transform your life. And yes, it was far-fetched that a girl who spent her freshman year institutionalized could get into, a Columbia or a University of Pennsylvania or Harvard. But just getting out of my situation at all felt completely ridiculous and unlikely to happen.
Yeah. So the time begins to come in which you need to begin to make the pitch to various schools to become a student. And you were grappling with how one goes about this. And at the same time, there are yet other very heavy mitigating circumstances and things that you've experienced of sexual trauma and sexual violence that you recount a number of instances that are horrific. And so you're carrying all of this as you try to make sense of what the next season of your life is going to be. And then you, I think it's just fascinating that here you are as a child, and there's all this sort of this push against the stories that you'll tell, in whether it's in foster care or whether it's in therapy, where you get called out for so-called manipulating because you're trying to get your needs met. And yet then you began to see that there seems to be almost like a required manipulation or some sort of way of telling your story in a way that's going to get you where you want to go, that requires you to kind of play a game. But would you unpack kind of what you feel like that game was, or what you had to do in that process?
Yeah. When I was in therapy and then residential treatment and then foster care, really anything that I did that made life harder for adults was labeled manipulation. Like there was one time when I was going to go visit my brother, and I asked 2 different staff members at the facility, hey, did I get this pass? Am I going to be able to see him? And asking somebody twice was considered manipulation. If one person didn't know the answer and you asked somebody else, you would be punished, as I was. And I wasn't allowed to go see him. I had to spend the whole weekend indoors. And that teaches you something. It teaches you that you should not advocate for yourself, and that doing so is bad and makes you a bad person. But then just a few years later, I was applying for college, and it was the summer break at boarding school, and my mom's house was worse than ever, but my foster care file had been closed when I went to school. And so I found myself bouncing from friend's sofa to friend's sofa before finally running out of places to stay just after having a surgery and, being on all these painkillers with my legs taped in bandages, sleeping in the backseat of my car as I tried to write these college essays. And what I was learning in this college application process is that what people called manipulation was really survival. That you had to portray yourself in a certain way to have any chance at getting into an elite university. I could not simply tell people the truth of, look at me. I haven't showered in a week. I smell bad. My greasy hair is matted to my scalp. You should accept me to Harvard. That was not a sales pitch that was going to work. And so instead, I was learning, I had to portray myself as this perfect overcomer who had been made stronger by all that I had faced. When I really had not overcome anything because I was still in the middle of it. But I had to tell the story, and I had to find a way that despite still being in this situation of precarity and being always in situations where somebody could easily choose to hurt me, I had to make it sound like I had already won. And that was really what colleges required, and in many ways what America requires from people who are disadvantaged.
You say at one point things like, I am a whore of my sadnesses. Or then you say, every time I had to sell myself, in scare quotes, every time I had to sell myself, the distinction between what produced revulsion versus what prompted praise weighed on me. Or then again, I stuffed manila envelopes full of my traumas and submitted them for the judge's consideration. When the facts themselves didn't depress me, I felt high on the hope that I might cash in on my sorrows. Do you, when you were going through this, were you able to reflect upon those things with that sort of clarity? I mean, it just seems, it's remarkable to me to think about you as a 16, 17-year-old being able to think that clearly about what was going on.
I'm not sure I had that kind of clarity intellectually, but I definitely felt the internal emotional tension and upheaval.
Yeah.
Where I felt like an enormous liar. Because I was, at that point, my senior year of high school, I was under really significant stress. I was relapsing into eating disorder behaviors. I had lost a lot of weight. I was abusing Adderall. I was not in a good, healthy place, which I had learned to think about as being in itself a moral failure. And yet I was putting on this song and dance of saying, look, like I'm a survivor, right? I'm so wonderful. You should accept me. And I think that is just generally very difficult for teenagers when you're at a period of your life where authenticity is the fundamental question. You're figuring out, who am I? But at the same time, before I could figure out who I was, I had to create a version of myself to show to the admissions committee, to scholarship contests, to all of that. And that tension between the reality and the image was incredibly painful. And I really did not have the skills or the context to understand. And I think it would be years to really recognize that as adults, we have a private life and we have a public life, and those things do not always match up, and that's okay. But I think especially around the framing of college admissions and the way we think about people lifting themselves up out of poverty and precarity, we really do expect people to be perfect in a way that I knew I was not. And I just didn't realize yet that nobody is perfect in that way. And those perfect human interest stories are fictions.
There's just one passage in that I'll read here in just a moment, but it strikes me as one of the weights, I think, of reading your book is to realize how hard it may be as an adult to really hear what a teenager or a child is trying to communicate, and that to really pay attention in such a way. And obviously, as you've already indicated, right, we all know, and those of us who have children know that children and teenagers, they're working through this process of growing up and maturation, and we often have to expect things of them that they're just not quite ready for. And so that all makes it all the more difficult to kind of try to hear in and really hear what they're saying. But at one point you say, you're talking about a guidance counselor who didn't know about your family situation, and she would get frustrated with you about talking so much about college and this sort of dream that you had about college. And then you said, quote, "She didn't understand how college was a metonym for safety, security, and for my entire future." And when I read that, I thought that seemed like a very helpful way for adults to think about listening to teenagers and children. And that is that they're often maybe talking in metonyms, that they'll point to one thing, but it's not that thing necessarily. It's something underneath that thing that they're really trying to get at that they might not have words for. And that if we would just simply try to take this skill, develop this skill of listening, we might say metonomically as opposed to literally to children. But I don't know, how does that strike you?
I'm so glad you called out that passage. And I think when I look back and I wonder what could have been different, the one thing that I really wish could have been different was having adults be on my side when I had these certain goals. Where I was very fixated on college, and I was willing to do literally anything in the world to achieve that dream. And that list of things I was willing to do included being kinder to myself, eating lunch, not hurting myself. Whereas the goals that were kind of imposed on me from adults, like deal with your trauma, stop hurting yourself for the sake of not hurting yourself. I frankly wasn't willing to do anything to achieve those goals because they weren't my goals. And now that I'm older and I'm preparing to become a parent and I have nieces and nephews and mentees, I recognize how terrifying it is to see a young person harming themselves or doing things that really seem to be jeopardizing their future and going against their self-interest. And I also think that the most powerful tool of change is that internal motivation and being willing to engage with me on it. And, a lot of people were like, it's great that you have this goal, but it's totally unrealistic. And that was not really helpful for me to hear, because I think at the end of the day, yes, it was really a long shot to get into one of these schools. And along the way, I was going to make so many changes that would ultimately help me no matter what the outcome was.
Yeah. So you get your acceptance letter and you get into Harvard. And then you say, the shame of my past would be erased because I meant something. But not surprisingly to the reader, but perhaps surprisingly to the 18-year-old Emi, this moment does not yield happily ever after. So unpack some of that for us.
Yeah. When I got that acceptance letter, it felt like my life split in half. I was sitting at a public library. I saw the word congratulations, and I just started screaming. Annoying, 200 library patrons, a bunch of librarians. I ran out into the rain. I was dancing. I was screaming more. And I was just I proved everybody wrong. I was filled with this satisfaction of all the people for whom I could just rub it in their face, And then reality came in where, yes, my future was going to be very, very different. And I was still a teenage girl on my own, without a family. I was staying by myself in a hostel during spring break from boarding school, and I was super, super lonely. And it was really after getting that big success that I started to realize, oh my gosh, this might not actually just erase all of my problems in the way that I hoped it would. And from there, I would have a big reckoning of, how is this actually changing my life versus how am I still vulnerable? What am I still dealing with at home and in my relationships? And, maybe to other people, it would have been obvious, like, yeah, this is not going to make all your problems go away. But I really had been counting on that. And yeah. And so then you have to go through that whole process of adulthood, of recognizing, like, how am I going to deal with this history that I have, and also deal with the new problems that are going to come up that I'm actually not shielded from just because I'm attending an elite university.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As you get into Harvard, you say that you begin to learn what you call necessary skills, which you say you learn accidentally, often due to self-destructive impulses. And that strikes me as a sort of moving counterintuitive experience. I think a lot of us have, in the sense that when we inherit certain traumas or we inherit certain difficulties, a whole lot of moving toward a new place is certainly kind of learning some of the basics of how to live that we hadn't picked up somehow along the way. And it can be, in fact, that our self-destructive behaviors kind of force us to learn these things. And that seems like one of the things that happens with you at Harvard.
Absolutely. I remember when I was a junior in when I was a junior at Harvard, I went on this extreme elimination diet. I won't name it, but it's very popular. And I went into it really hoping to lose some weight. I had gained weight since my eating disorder lows, and I wasn't really happy with it. I had bad body image. So I went on this diet. But then along the way, I discovered the foods that I have been eating did not make me feel good. I was a vegetarian for more than a decade. And then I realized, I'm extremely sensitive to beans. Like, beans make me feel horrible. I was drinking a dozen cans of Diet Coke a day, and then I would get aspartame headaches. And I just never had that type of self-awareness. I mean, who does? But only through kind of these negative impulses, I was trying new things and then realizing, okay, some of my mental health, a big part of my mental health is actually like physical health. And there are ways that I could be taking care of myself much, much better. And those changes for me ended up being far more important than the therapy I had received, far more helpful than medication, when I was able to just eat, sleep, exercise, and have consistency, a place to live, a roof over my head. That really made all the difference.
Yeah. Yeah, it is remarkable to think about reframing certain basics like diet, exercise, sleep, routines, social connections, as sort of the ground out of which mental health can arise, right? Or flourishing mental health can arise. But I think so often I'll see my own students, not take care of some of those basics, and then the wave of negative implications that has on their lives. And sometimes it is these basic skills that are going to be a crucial next step forward. So you find your way through Harvard, become a varsity athlete, get a huge job offer with Google, you fall in love, you marry, and yet meanwhile the traumas, as you've already indicated, they continue to haunt you. And so what's this process like, beginning to face your story or to re-narrate it in a way in which you are looking, it seems to me, for a more true way to understand your reality than you had to that point?
In the years after I graduated college, I really believed that what I was experiencing was just the human condition. that it was normal to never be able to relax, to not be able to spend 15 minutes extra in bed in the morning without having things come back to haunt you. I swung from one extreme of thinking, okay, everything that's happening in my life is a sign of mental illness, to thinking, all of this is normal. Even as I had to do more and more to keep my past at bay. I joined the rowing team while I was at Harvard, which was an incredible experience, and also, in a way, became another form of self-harm, where I was working out so much that I got very injured. And even after I graduated and there was no more competition, I started working out 2-3 hours a day, because that was really the only way that I knew to discharge this feeling that came over my body of heat and shame. And I just had to go run for miles and miles and lift weights and do spinning classes to try to get that feeling to dissipate, even for a little while, so that I could feel any type of peace. It was really when I was 25 and I was getting ready to get married, and I had to file a HR report against somebody at work for harassment, which is an experience that I've written about in the New York Times and touch on a little bit in the book. But it was really that perfect storm that made me realize I really need some help. I do not think that what I'm experiencing is what every other person around me is experiencing. And I think I have post-traumatic stress disorder, which might have been obvious to other people that you go through some of this stuff and then you get PTSD. But, I wasn't eager to put a label on myself. And I did end up in therapy, first some really bad therapy, and then eventually some really good therapy that was very helpful to me. But really what I found is that I had these horrible memories, right, that manifest in nightmares and flashbacks and physical symptoms. But I also had this overwhelming sense that I should be okay, that I had made it out. I was living the American dream, and therefore I should be happy every day of my life and eternally grateful. Because I knew that I was really lucky, and I was so aware of all of the people who had been in similar situations, who had not made it out, and who were still struggling, who perhaps had lost their lives. And it made me feel so ungrateful, so unworthy. And I really think that it was this expectation going back to high school and to the college admissions process, this narrative that's so important to us as Americans of being able to turn any tragedy into triumph. And that's what we can do, and that's what we should do, and that we're morally obligated to do it. And so when I was still suffering from the impact of these things, it made me feel like the world would be a better place without me, because I was so bad that I couldn't just be even happier that I had gone through all of this.
Yeah. You, another thread that runs through the whole book, it seems to me, is this way in which other emotional felt needs of adults becomes a sort of perceived requirement on your side to fix them, help them, comfort them, and thereby delegitimating your own sorts of emotional needs. And it seems like that's one of the things that you kind of are having to process during this season after you get out of college. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. One of the big things that was weighing on me was my relationship with my mom, where I loved her deeply. I knew that she loved me. And I really wanted to have that kind of hallmark ending relationship with her where we could see eye to eye, we could come to terms with everything that had happened, and we could kind of forge a mutual understanding of my life that allowed us to have a close, happy relationship. And that belief that that was what I really needed to be happy and have a good adulthood, that was really weighing on me, especially because as I started to confront some of the things that happened in high school, her version of events was totally different than mine. And it would sometimes change week to week as I tried to talk to her about it, where she would say one week, oh, this thing happened. And then the next week, no, that's not what happened at all. And luckily, because I was writing acceptance, I was taking notes on everything and was able to look back and be like, I'm not making this up. Like, she really has changed her mind. But I think that expectation that adult children should find ways to reconcile with their parents at all costs, and that relationship is the most important thing, and even more important than like happiness or like sanity, that was really weighing on me, and it made it really hard for me to even function.
Yeah, there's this sort of, and I don't know that you want to go into the details here, and if you do, fine. If you don't, fine. But your own sort of kind of grappling with this sense that some of the horrific things that had happened to you had carried around or gotten from various sources, this sort of message, including your mother, that was your fault, and this sort of need for a different narrative to be told around where blame was getting laid.
Yeah, absolutely. I felt like I was willing to forgive my mom for just about anything, right? Like, I came to the table being like, the hoarding doesn't matter, foster care doesn't matter, like, we can move past everything. But what made it really hard for me is that shortly after I got into Harvard, I was sexually assaulted while traveling by myself. And both the attack itself was awful, and it also seemed to be, in many ways, a metaphor for some of the ways I had been betrayed by people who were supposed to help me. And the ways that when things went wrong, I was held responsible, even when that was absurd. And so as I was getting into my mid-20s, that night really took on all of this emotional weight of what had happened during high school. And in my conversations about it with my mom, it just always came back to my responsibility and to arguing over this question of, like, had I accepted a drink from these men who set me up? Like, what had I done wrong? And I feel like I was moving heaven and earth to try to find a way to reconcile these narratives where both my mom could be right and I could be right. But after literally years of trying to do this, one day I was like, is this even possible? Like, is there logically a way to square these two things? And it seemed like trying to find this story that my mom would be happy with, and by proxy all these other adults, that was really going to keep me sick, potentially forever. Because while we like to believe that you can just be made stronger by everything that happens to you, I really do not believe that that's true. I think some things really hurt us, and it's important to acknowledge that. And if you don't accept that certain things are harmful, how do you ever have the motivation to try to create change and prevent those things from happening to other people?
Yeah. Well, that's a good place to segue back into this conversation that we began earlier about acceptance. And you have a number of hooks, I think, that kind of all in my mind, the conversations relate around the notions of agency, the notion of victimhood, the notion of grit, the notion of acceptance. That there's something about the way those things get discussed that you found deeply distressing and or unhelpful to you. And on the other hand, as I read your memoir, it seemed to me that you're pointing us toward the need that we have to someone to bear witness to the profound sorrow and pain that someone has experienced, for which one is not responsible, and to just hear someone say, "You're not to blame for that, and this is grievous that you had to bear that pain." But is that right to kind of that these kinds of different approaches you're kind of putting in a juxtaposition or tension with one another throughout the book?
As you mentioned, I wrote a lot about resilience and about this twisted idea that we have of resilience, where you should just be able to put up with anything and quote unquote accept whatever life throws your way, and do so without complaining, without putting up a fuss, just take it. And this isn't just an expectation that I felt. This is something that so many people have since told me that they have experienced. And particularly the more marginalized you are, the more that you are told that your pain does not matter and that you should just suffer in silence. But I think that this idea of acceptance, where I had been told, don't try to change your life, just put up with it, that idea, I think, is a bad one in many cases. But I did rethink this idea of acceptance as I was coming into my young adulthood and as I was writing the book, where it really seemed like we have this idealized version of trauma where you come through it and you're so much stronger, blah, blah, blah. But I think that there's real power in recognizing, hey, these experiences changed me, and I accept those changes. I am a different person because of what happened to me, and that's okay. And I think every single person walking on this planet, we're all shaped by our lives. And there can be incredible power in owning that, and also in recognizing that in other people and saying, you are still okay. And for me, it was really only when I let go of that expectation that I should be perfect and be so strong all the time that I was able to really find what felt like authentic happiness. I had to have that grief and that sorrow, recognize it, and have other people recognize it and validate it in order to be like, that is all true. And I have a wonderful partner. I have a wonderful job. I have a wonderful life, and meet my life on its own terms.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I've as I processed your storytelling, I thought of a season of my own in trauma in therapy where I remember this one particular day I was doing this one particular therapy, and after the therapist had been working with me for 90 minutes or 2 hours, I was sobbing, I was cursing. I threw we had these paddles in our hands. I threw the paddle across the room, was cursing. And it was a very profound moment because what happened was that as I wrote her a letter later, the therapist a letter later, I said, I think what happened to me in that process was that I realized that there were some adults who should have known better, who either didn't know better or couldn't do better, and they should have, but they didn't. And then that propelled me into what I called a new quest for a healthy I don't give a damn. And so this sort of notion of acknowledging the irreversibility of true trauma or pain that does indeed shape us and affect us. And then at the same time, at some point, I needed people to push me and say, not to deny what I had experienced, but to then say, okay, you still do have agency, and now you can make some choices. And I think it was for me, it was the both and. And then before I ask you to respond to that, all of this conversation is super helpful to me because I'm also right now, I have been rereading. We're not rereading. I've been reading. I've known Stoicism, secondhand for many, many years, and I generally have found a lot of that stuff helpful. And because of another interview we did with somebody a few weeks ago, I went back up and picked the philosopher Epictetus's Enchiridion, which is kind of one of the basic manuals of Stoic philosophy. And he's huge on acceptance, right? His big deal is you focus only on what you can control and don't focus on the things you can't control. And this sort of sense of pain, difficulty, and so forth, trying to figure out a way to accept it. And so he unpacks that in various ways that I find really, really interesting. And I also practically find it very, very helpful for me in not getting into as much depression, because what I find for myself is that when I'm obsessing about things I cannot control, I can get depressed in very unhelpful ways. But I have this nagging sense as I read it. The question that keeps arising as I read it is, but isn't there much more that has to be said? And if you don't say the much more, then you're going to overlook justice and systems of power and the way we construct our communities. And so I think that's what you're also pointing to. It's like there is this sort of thing of acceptance, but there's other stuff that has to be said too, right? There needs to be adults who say what's happening to this child is not acceptable and it needs to be changed. But I don't know, respond to any of that or push back or whatever you might want to say about any of that.
That reminds me so much of a James Baldwin quote that I encountered in high school. And over the years, I would always think about the first part of this quote, which goes that, I'm going to paraphrase it, but that you have to hold these two truths in your head at once. The first is the acceptance of the world as it is and men as they are, totally and without rancor. And that was like an ideal that I had in my head. I would go through that first part of the quote again and again, and I knew that there was a second part, but I kind of forgot what it was. And it was only as I was finishing up acceptance that I went back and I looked up this quote from Notes from a Native Son. And the second part of the quote was, the second thing you have to hold in your head is that we should fight against injustice with all of our might and never, ever accept the injustice that's in the world. And that you have to do both. And that it's really hard, that it tries to split you in half. But I think he really summed it up. And I think it is so useful, like as a person, to like set aside all those things that you have finite control over. And I don't think we do ourselves any favors when we act like our own individual choices are the only things in the world that matter. I think we have to have that compassion for each other and for ourselves to recognize that there are bigger problems in the world that are worthy of our attention and our care. And that we should, be fighting against personally and collectively.
Thank you for that. Yeah, we'll post that quote on our show notes.
Get the real one, not my paraphrase.
Yeah. Did you indicate that you were preparing for a child?
I am. I'm 38 and a half weeks pregnant, actually.
Oh, wow. Congratulations.
Thank you.
How do you frame this new season of life that you're coming into out of things that you've learned, and or let me ask it this way, perhaps, what excites you about this new season of life, and what perhaps fills you with fear and trembling?
Oh, man. What a great question. I think I'm excited to hopefully give my child a totally different family experience than I had. And I've heard from a lot of other people who had really awful childhoods that sometimes when you have a kid, you basically replace your idea of childhood. You stop thinking about what you went through and you replace those memories with memories of seeing your own child grow up. And some of those sad memories you just overwrite with happy memories of your kid. And I have just the most wonderful partner who comes up in the book and really just is the love of my life. And I really am excited to bring someone into the world who gets to experience that and hopefully who, it gets enough like love that it makes them want to make the world a better place. And I'm also really nervous about, parents will always mess up their kids. Every single parent, no matter how good you are, your kid is going to be like, I need therapy. Like you did all these bad things. And also a lot of the social problems that I was grappling with as a teenager, like economic inequality, healthcare system, those things have not gotten better. If anything, they've gotten worse. Mm-hmm. And it was a lot to navigate as a teenager. And I think it'll be a lot for my child and for this generation. It's a lot for them to navigate too.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there any question that you wish I had asked you today that I haven't asked you yet?
I love it when people ask that question. I think it's the best question in the world. But no, I feel it. I really loved your questions and loved our conversation.
I did too. Yeah, I'm very thankful for it. And again, I'm very thankful for the book and thankful for the gift that you give us in that book. And I think, do you have the book handy right there with you?
I just put it here. I need to bump it forward a little, but yeah.
Yeah. Would you be willing to kind of let me set this up and you read just those last two paragraphs in the book? In the last number of pages of the book, you tell a story about reconnecting. As you're kind of piecing together all this narrative, you reconnect with a young man that was kind to you at a traumatic moment at an embassy in Europe, and you reach out to him, and in time he responds, and he said that in spite of all the horror that he had seen that you'd gone through and what you had experienced, that he saw that you were deeply troubled, but thought that you would find a way to salvage your life, I think was the word, salvage. And you, in this very nicely nuanced way, you distinguish between a life that is salvaged versus one that is simply redeemed, in the sense of that all of this horrible stuff is in a simplistic way redeemed, and everything's okay because you get to a good end. You got to go to Harvard, and you got a good job at Google, and you got married. And instead, you want to hold on to this notion that, no, these painful things are indeed truly painful, and they're truly grievous, and they shake us, and they change us, and they wound us, and we then carry those wounds with us. And then you close with these two beautiful paragraphs, I think. And would you be willing to share those with us?
Yes. Instead of making a life that would redeem the past, an impossible feat, I sought out a life that I could live with. For the first time, I felt lucky for the little things. To wake up in the morning in my own bed, to eat breakfast, to do my work. It was no longer so important to me to achieve something great because I was happy to be alive, which had seemed impossible and tenuous. I became grateful for the passing of time, each milestone that brings me away from then into now. My marriage, buying an apartment, changing jobs, each new stuffed animal, one day a child of our own, for whom I swear I will not make the same mistakes, though I know I'll fall short in some regard. On my wall, I have a poster that always reminds me of when I was growing up. A girl stares out the window at a city while a plane crosses in front of the moon. Every time I see it, I say a prayer of gratitude to my younger self for delivering me here into adulthood, where I can make my own peace with what I learned along the way.
Been talking to Emi Nietfeld on her beautiful new memoir entitled Acceptance. Thank you, Emi.
Thank you so much, Lee.
Hey there, I'm Dr. Maya Shankar, and I'm a scientist who studies human behavior. Many of us have experienced a moment in our lives that changes everything, that instantly divides our life into a before and an after. On my podcast, A Slight Change of Plans, I talk to people about navigating these moments. Their stories are full of candor and hard-won wisdom. And you'll hear from scientists who teach us how we can be more resilient in the face of change. Listen on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carrie Harmon, Jason Sheasley, Ellis Osborne, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studio.